Hey everybody, it's Mark Vo with Vogtland Outdoors, and I went because today is a tough topic. Today we're going to talk about shooting barebow, but compensating left to right for windage. But first, roll them. Yeah, still thinking about it. Adjusting for windage is a learned skill, but there's a few pointers that I can tell you about that hopefully you'll be able to find some usefulness with. Thought number one, there are basically three types of wind. There are headwinds coming right at you. There are tailwinds that are coming from behind you, and there are crosswinds that go either direction. And they can influence the arrow's flight either a little bit or a great deal, depending on a lot of factors. Number one, the speed of the arrow. Number two, the distance you're shooting. It sounds obvious, but sometimes you got to say it. The longer the arrow is in that wind, the more opportunity that wind has to influence the trajectory of the arrow. Sounds obvious when you think about it, but that's why a lot of compound archers shoot 70-pound bows. They're shooting 310, 20, 30, 340 feet per second, compared to my recurve bow, 50 pounds, shooting 170, 180 feet per second. I am literally in the air twice as long as they are. So the trajectory is flatter on a compound bow, and it's faster. It has less time for the wind to influence the shot to the left, to the right, up or down. So most of the time it's going to be the Olympic recurve. It's going to be the recurve archers, not the compound bow archers, that have to worry about windage a lot, because we're literally in the air twice as long. It matters. Next, let's talk about how the wind can actually influence the shot. I can only talk to my own experience shooting fletchings that are feathered. And what I have seen in practice, guys, is that when I'm shooting with a headwind, the wind is coming at me from the target, I actually will gain yardage. I won't lose it. You would think that that's going to knock the arrow down and it's going to go shorter, like with a golf shot, like with throwing a baseball, like with a tennis ball. But in practice, what I've seen is the opposite. I tend to gain yardage, and the way that I think it happens is this. The wind coming at the arrow tends to, when the arrow's coming down like this, that wind coming at it tends to knock the back down, lift the arrow up, and you end up gaining yardage. How much yardage? On a 90-meter shot, I will gain 10 yards. I will gain 10 meters, about that. So keep that in mind, about a tenth. You will gain about a tenth of the distance. So if you're shooting at 20 yards, you're going to actually, it's going to fly like it's like you were aiming at 22 yards, something like that. A tailwind then does exactly the opposite. While you would think that with a plane or with a ball, a golf ball, a tennis ball, even a baseball hit, you gain distance with a tailwind, it seems to be the opposite in my own experience with an arrow. That when the arrow is flying and the tailwind hits it from behind, it actually lifts the back of the arrow up, points the arrow down, and I end up losing 10 yards over 90. So I have to compensate about 1/10. Remember, a headwind, you gain yardage. A tailwind, you lose yardage. So you have to aim a little bit higher. With a headwind, you gain yardage, so aim a little bit shorter. Crosswinds. Crosswinds don't, in theory, change the distance. But since the arrow technically is following a longer path, you also lose a little bit of yardage with any crosswind. Because if you have to aim a little bit off center, you're aiming along the hypotenuse of a right triangle between you, the target where you're aiming, and that's a longer distance. However small, 1-2 yards, it ends up changing the length that the arrow is in the air, the time that the wind is influencing it, so it's as if it's a slightly farther distance. So in a crosswind, you want to aim a little bit farther. How much? Depending on if you're shooting in any wind that you're going out and saying, I'm still going to go shoot today, then I would say that's under 15 miles an hour. If it's under 15 miles an hour, it's going to influence that shot about 5%, not 10%. So if I'm shooting in a crosswind at 50 meters, I'm going to shoot it like it's 50 plus 10% would be 5 meters. Half of that would be 2.5 meters. I'm going to shoot like it's a distance of 52.5 meters. Very simple math. Take 10%, cut it in half, add that onto the distance, and that's what you're going to aim for any kind of a crosswind from 0 to about 15 miles an hour. And as it gets closer and closer to 0, you're adjusting less and less and less. So I'm just giving you some basic frames of reference. That's all strictly in terms of numbers, but what I've also seen is this, practical shooting. If you were to look at that target over there, and you knew you had a crosswind that was pushing the arrow this way, and your absolute goal is that you needed to land on the target. If you needed to land on the target, then if you aim only for this edge, thinking that the arrow is going to drift over to center, what if there's no wind? You graze past the target. If you aim right for the center of that target behind me, and there's a wind this way, if the wind's strong enough, it could very well push all the way off the bag and you miss again. You're either grazing it on one edge or you're missing it and grazing it on the other edge by aiming either at the edge or at the dead center. So what do? I could tell you what I do. I look at a target like that, guys, and I break it up into halves. This edge, the dead center, and that edge. Like this. And then I split this distance. If the wind is coming from right to left, I take half of this distance from here to center and I aim there. So on the bag, I take this distance right here, I cut it in half, and right there is where I'm going to aim. Now, why would I do that? I'll tell you. Let me zoom in. If I zoom in, and I'm aiming right here, then if there's a crosswind, however light, if it's hardly there at all, let me take an arrow and put it out. If this is where I'm aiming, can I do this better? If this is where I'm aiming right here, then if there's no crosswind, I still hit the target. I hit the bag. If there is a crosswind from right to left, it's going to shift over and I'm going to at least hit the center of the target and maybe hit off to this side. But I've got literally 3/4 of the target that the wind could push me across from here all the way to here, and I'm still hitting the bag. And if there's a really big crosswind, it may end up drifting all the way over here, but I'm still on the bag. So by taking one side from center to the edge, cutting it in half and aiming at that center, that 1/4 of the way over, I've got 3/4 of the target that it could drift across. And quite likely it's not going to drift the whole way. So I have half the target becomes fair game. It's virtually guaranteed I'm going to be landing on the bag. And all I have to do is worry about the distance that I'm going to be aiming at. I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to hit the bag. But you're guaranteed, whether the wind comes up or whether the wind is as strong as possible, you're virtually guaranteed at hitting some very important part of the target, what I'll call the kill zone. Is it an absolute kill shot, the left ventricle of the heart? No. It is a mortally wounding shot? Yeah, very realistically, it's a mortal shot that you're actually landing on that particular deer or that particular target. And that's what this is all about. You're trying to adjust for windage in order to be able to create a mortal wound on the deer. Is it the ideal wound? No. You're not in ideal conditions, so you don't get to think that way. When you're shooting in a crosswind, it's less than ideal. When you're shooting in a rain, it's less than ideal. You have to adjust your expectations from aiming like this to aiming like, not like this, but aiming like this in a range. So splitting that difference from one edge to the center and aiming for that 1/4 spot is probably your best friend for guaranteeing a hunting shot that's going to end up being a mortal wound. Now let's talk about shooting actually on a target like this. What else have you got available to you? You've got your knowledge of how big the target is, and you typically have your arrow available to you. So I'll talk in terms of arrow widths. There are times when I'll aim, I'm not going to aim splitting of the center and one edge of the target. I'm going to aim in terms of arrow widths off to the side. 1 arrow width off to the side, 2 arrow widths off to the side, 3 arrow widths off to the side. Why? Because I can measure that when I'm at full draw. When I'm at full draw, my arrow is looking like this. You're the target, and I can say for windage, I'm going to aim 1 arrow width to the side, 1 arrow width to the side, and then I can release. It's got to be something that you can do quickly, because at full draw with 50, 55, 60 pounds, you only have about 8 seconds at most before you start bouncing around and your muscles start to fatigue. It's got to be something that's repeatable. It's got to be something that's based on a particular width that you have readily available to you, not something on the bag. And your arrow width at known distances, then the size of the target doesn't matter anymore. It only matters what the distance is and what the crosswind is, because this is consistent. You shoot the same arrows all the time, so that width can become a learned thing. Oh, for a 5 mile an hour crosswind, I go 1 arrow width to the right, 1 arrow width to the left, 2 arrow widths, 3 arrow widths, land on the bag. So if you think in terms of those arrow widths, you'll find out that as time goes by, when you're shooting like even in a maximum 15 mile an hour wind, you're going to get about a 3 arrow drift at 100 yards at 90 meters. 1, 2, 3. That's about all the farther that you have to worry. And you've got a unit of measure that you can carry with you with any bow, at any range, at any size target. Little itty bitty targets or really, really big targets doesn't matter anymore, because this, the arrow width, is your unit of measure. Hope you guys found. Let's shoot a couple and just see what happens. One of the hardest things about doing a video on how to compensate for a crosswind is when you come and it's a perfect day for shooting, slightly overcast, and there is virtually no wind. But I'll just try aiming. I'll see if I can. You look over my shoulder and I'll tell you what I'm actually doing. So let's say I'm shooting at that bag. My target is the dead center of that blue square, so right in the white. But I know that there's a crosswind coming from camera right to camera left, and it's a really stiff breeze. I'm at 20 meters, so I know that in that short of a distance, it's only going to move about 1 arrow width. In the time that it takes to get to the bag, it's going to move 1 arrow width away. So that's what I'm going to aim for. I'm going to choose my gap. I'm going to draw back an anchor under my chin. I'm going to look down the left edge of the bowstring. I'm going to put the tip of the arrow in the center of the target. And then I'm going to move 1 arrow width to the right and release. Now, no wind, you saw a straight shot. It went exactly where I was aiming, 1 arrow width to the right. But if there had been a wind, it would have influenced the shot, pushed it off to the side. We would have seen it get closer to center. What else can I show you in a video where there's no crosswinds? There's no tailwind today, there's no nothing. Look all the way around here. Absolutely nothing. For all intents and purposes, it's a perfect day for an archery video, except for one about how to shoot in a wind. To the people that requested this in the last week, see if these tips help you. Thinking in terms of arrow widths, thinking in terms of splitting the bag up or your target up into halves, and then choosing the quarter, aiming at the quarter waypoint to the windward side, knowing that the wind is going to push it in the other direction, and see if that helps you. This is Mark Vogt with Vogtland Outdoors. Feel free to subscribe to my channel if you find this and stuff on fly fishing useful, and we'll see you out there. Cut. Let's do another example, an imaginary one. Let's say there's a headwind coming at me. So now I know I'm going to gain yardage. which means I have to aim as if I'm shooting at a shorter, closer target. The target behind me is 20 meters. I said if it's a really stiff tailwind, you're going to take 10% off. So I'm going to take 20 meters, 10% is 2 meters. I'm going to try to make a gap for 18 meters, 18 meters, a shorter distance. That means my gap has to get a little bit bigger between the knocking point of the arrow and the drawing point of my index finger, so that the back lifts up, the back of the arrow lifts up, so I shoot shorter distance. What does that look like? Looks like this. 3.5 fingers is my 20 meters gap. My 10 meter interval gap is about a half of a finger here. So that means a 5 meter gap is a quarter of a finger, and a 2 meter gap is a eighth of a finger, a half of a half of a half. In other words, just a little bit wider like that. So if I shoot with this gap in a headwind, it's going to lift the arrow up, it's going to shoot a little bit further, and it should land dead center on the bag. If I aim for the center of that cross and there's no wind, then the worst case scenario is I end up a little bit short. So let's see if that's what happens. Since there is no wind, I'm going to choose my gap. It's for 18 meters. Draw back an anchor under my chin. Look down the left edge of the bowstring. That's my rear sight. Put the tip of the arrow on the center of the target. That's my front sight. And make a small motion release. And I ended up just a little bit low, just like I expected. You guys know how hard it is to talk and shoot at the same time. Let's do another experiment. Let's pretend there's a tailwind coming in. With a tailwind, I'm actually going to lose yardage. So I have to add 10% onto the distance and then set my gap for that longer distance. It's set for 20 meters right now. It's a tailwind, an imaginary tailwind. I add 2 meters on, and then I create a gap for that. Here's my 20 meter shot, and instead of increasing it by a little bit, I'm going to decrease it by a little bit. So now I'm bringing the back of the arrow down, lifting the tip up, and it's going a little bit further. If there's not really a wind, like today, then if I aim dead center, I should end up landing a little bit higher. So let's see if that happens. I've set my gap. I'm going to draw back an anchor under my chin. Look down the left edge of the bowstring. That's my rear sight. Put the tip of the arrow on the dead center of the target. That's my front sight. Make a small motion release. And you'll see I added a little bit high. So in a tailwind, that height is going to drop down. The tailwind is going to take that height away, and you'll end up with a better shot. Geez, I'm struggling. All right, that's it.